So say Aneen, hello everyone. I'm Nikki Paradas from the Center for Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And I want to thank everyone virtually for joining the webinar or accessing it online. And this will serve as an orientation for delivering the Homeownership in Indian Country Tribal Leaders Creating the Opportunity for Choice presentation. And so this will really serve as a tutorial for delivering the message of homeownership and its importance, and also sharing some important resources, both for tribal leaders and the practitioners and communities that they work with. So this presentation is based on the Tribal Leaders Handbook on Homeownership, which is a comprehensive guide to creating diverse housing choices for Native communities by understanding the lending and the development process in Indian Country, particularly on trust lands. And the handbook is a result of the work of the Center for Indian Country Development and its National Native Homeownership Coalition. And we really believe that good information is key to making informed decisions. And we thank you for sharing this time with us. So we'll just kind of get into it, but we hope that you use, again, this presentation to highlight your own nation or your own organization's best practices and to really amplify this message. So our goals are really to motivate tribal leaders and housing leaders to understand and support the lending and development process. So it's been about 6 months since our initial group of tribal leaders and housing leaders had met at the National Congress of American Indians 75th Annual Convention. And there we talked about the need for something like this webinar to exist so people can really take up the message and spread it far and wide. So we appreciate the suggestion, and we also appreciate all of our partners that have given a lot of space and time, like NCAI, like the National American Indian Housing Council, like our partners also at First Nations OWISTA, and many other national organizations. And we thank also NeighborWorks America for helping host this webinar and share their platform with us. So I'll just jump into it. This orientation serves as this first kind of virtual kickoff for kind of creating resources and materials for what we hope will be not just tribal leader ambassadors carrying the message of homeownership across Indian Country, but also community ambassadors as well. So after a walkthrough of the presentation, I'll also share some opportunities for where this message can be presented, different events that we've already kind of presented at, and other opportunities for 2019, and where you can get in touch with us here at the CICD to let us know about other opportunities in your kind of part of Indian Country, so we don't miss any, and then also any other tools or resources that might be helpful beyond this tutorial in carrying out the message. So anyways, thank you again, and we'll just kind of get started. So as you can see, there's a cover slide here, Homeownership in Indian Country. And this slide is really the opportunity to introduce yourself, your nation or your organization, and your vision for housing and homeownership in your community. And really the goal of the presentation. So throughout the presentation, you can feel free to tailor your message, but we feel that, right, this is really answering two basic questions, but very high level questions. One is, what would it take to build new communities and remake old ones so reservations can move more decisively towards economic development that benefits tribal members? The second question that we feel this presentation addresses are, what are the financial and governance strategies that could most effectively overcome some of the impediments to those goals? So again, two big overarching questions, and also what we hope would be three major takeaways, which is that homeownership is possible even on trust lands. There are tribes that have done it successfully. There's a demand and a capacity in Indian country by tribal members for homeownership, and that tribal leaders, tribal elected leaders, really play a significant role in facilitating homeownership opportunities. And therefore, they really play a significant role in shaping local economies through more diverse housing choices. So I will take us to the next slide, which really serves as an overview. Before you jump into the presentation, people will want to know who the Center for Indian Country Development is, and also why the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and the Federal Reserve System is interested in Indian country. So you can be pretty brief with this slide in sharing the mission of the center, which is that we support the prosperity of Native nations through actionable research and community collaboration, and also the mission of your nation or organization. I think it's important to share that we will also have talking points that will accompany the PowerPoint slide, which will be made available on the CICD website. So you can find that at minneapolisfed.org/Indian country. But we'll also make kind of like a 1 to 3 pager of talking points available. So if you're not catching everything I'm saying, don't worry about it. We'll have follow-up resources. And one of those for this slide will be like a brief paragraph or so on the history of the Federal Reserve System in both community development and in this space specifically in Indian country. So I think without further ado, we'll move to the next slide, which really provides the overview of the entire presentation. So this presentation, again, is designed for tribal leaders to really better understand their role in developing homeownership opportunities, but also for them to walk away with informed ideas on kind of the next action steps that they can take when they return home. And in the last 6 months, the CICD has partnered with other tribal leaders, like Councilman Joe Garcia from Okeh-Owingeh, Governor Derek Valdo from Acoma Pueblo, and most recently, Chief Executive Melanie Benjamin from the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. And we've also partnered with housing leaders to deliver this presentation, really to highlight how homeownership is a driver of economic development, and to talk about how homeownership really positions tribes away from dependency on federal funds for housing by using private capital, and that tribal elected officials, again, really play this incredible role as key agents to creating homeownership opportunities for Native communities. So in those previous presentations, each really shared examples of how their tribal elected leaders, how their tribal councils are kind of walking the walk, so to speak. And at the end of the presentation, we always like to leave with, like, what are you gonna do next Tuesday to get started? And so we do have on our CICD website, under our homeownership resources, a tab that's called Getting Started. And so there's other resources there beyond this presentation. And one of them is called a Tribal Leaders Checklist. And so we often will leave the option for potential presenters to incorporate that into their presentation. But you won't see that here today, but do know that that's an option as well. It's kind of like a final activity, having them go through the checklist and identify maybe the first thing they're gonna do or they're gonna work on. And I think, again, the biggest thing besides encouraging tribal leaders to understand their role and really sink their teeth into it, is to let them know that, right, we can move past this mindset of inertia or the status quo and really kind of get them to see that change can be small, it can start very small, and it doesn't have to, right, necessitate endless meetings or these incredible strategic plans. You can start with even a housing needs assessment. So we'll talk about some of those other resources in the handbook. And so speaking of the Tribal Leaders Handbook, that's the third bullet point. And we'll talk about the resources within that handbook, that support tribal leaders and practitioners. So this next slide is sometimes the one that gets the most interaction out of your audience, and it's a good one to really draw your audience in, and it promotes the concept of homeownership, but it also serves as kind of a counter for some of the concerns that many elected leaders and housing leaders often have about homeownership, because as many of us know, a lot of communities across Indian country are still very skewed towards low-income rentals. So there are tribes and nations that are very advanced in their housing options, and there are some that maybe don't have as much diversity and again are still kind of working under that public housing model. So this slide is important, again, to counter some of the maybe misperceptions regarding demand and capacity in Indian country. And so we thought it was important to talk about, right, the prevalence of the concerns and really just using data to dispel some of those commonly held beliefs that, and I'm doing air quotes here, that our people are too poor for home ownership, that they won't qualify for a loan, and that many of them are not even interested. So the data tells a different story. And the data that we use comes from a number of different sources. Some of it is from the US Census Bureau. We've also looked at some of the recent national HUD studies regarding mortgage lending and housing in tribal areas. And we also look at, I believe, some data from Equifax, which talks about the credit scores that exist on reservations. And so the talking points, again, will have those data points for you, so I won't belabor them all here, but the high level message is there's a high need for homes. That's something we all know, but there's also a desire by our reservation residents, by our tribal members, to become homeowners. And one statistic I will share is that in that HUD study, 75% of reservation residents strongly desire homeownership. So for tribal leaders, that's a large part of your constituency that probably shouldn't be ignored. So that's important to underscore. We also have data that shows that incomes are on the rise and that credit scores, at least through the Equifax data, over half of them are already at prime credit. So that means a good half of our community already has, across Indian country, already has the capacity. So there's a market opportunity for sure for home ownership in Indian country, which is not a commonly held belief. So I think it's very important to make that point here with the slide. And there's important opportunities also for tribal members that live off the reservation. And that's where, again, the US Census Bureau data comes in, and it will talk about what the commuting workforce looks like. And some of those, right, incredible lost opportunities really for tribes to grow their local economies and to provide a place for people to return home and to raise their families, which is that third bullet point on the slide. And by being able to provide more housing opportunities, especially for those that can't afford a mortgage, tribes are also better able to meet the needs of all families, right, by freeing up the wait lists for their tribal housing for those that are really in need. So sometimes what we'll do with the slide as well is open it up to the audience and ask them for other examples of, you know, why homeownership is significant and why it's an important staple, not only in our local economies, but also in our cultures and our traditions. So I think if anything you take away from, I guess, this tutorial, it's also to breathe life into this presentation. So please take that as a rule. So give examples as often as you can, and then audience members typically will provide some other examples and narrative, which is great. Now, the next slide or two are just some follow-up slides to the why homeownership question. And this slide here focuses on that third bullet point, culture and community. And so this slide is really yours to shape as a presenter and to really give an example. So we know that culture and community are at the heart of Native homeownership. Right before that U.S. Public housing model was introduced, homeownership was largely a part of all of our histories and our traditions. And I think the wonderful thing is that in almost all of our communities, homeownership was also situated in family and community. So thinking of kind of newer concepts across the country of community development housing, that was not something new for us or for most of us. So I think that's always a powerful message. And when speaking about powerful messages, this photo, which is actually at Acoma Pueblo, and it shows both traditional and current housing for the Acoma Pueblo, it makes me think of kind of when I was recruiting Derek Valdo, who many know him as CEO of Ameren Risk, but he's also a tribal leader in his community. And when we were asking him to co-present, I told him I was so incredibly impressed that Acoma Pueblo had a home ownership rate of over 85%. And so he said, rather than me sit here and tell you about all of the lending relationships, excuse me, and all of kind of the financing or home ownership programs that we have at Acoma, it really is rooted in our history and culture that home ownership is an expectation. So unlike many other nations across the country, we really didn't subscribe to that public housing model, however many decades ago, and only relatively recently have offered kind of public housing rentals as an option. So I thought that was an incredibly powerful message to show the value of home ownership in his community. And even last week, I was presenting with, again, Melanie Benjamin of Mille Lacs, and she was sharing in her presentation examples of how home ownership in her community has allowed her family and other tribal members to come home, and which really has strengthened their ties to culture, to language, and again, to family. So she had a niece, I think, that she gave as an example, where her niece lived off the reservation and would often come home for ceremony at certain times of the year. And really just each time her kind of desire and longing to be home grew and grew. And luckily, Mille Lacs has a number of things that their nation is doing to support home ownership, both in terms of being a direct lender, but also in terms of kind of development and homebuyer education. So her niece relocated and is now very close in culture and language. And so I love that story, and it's one that really permeates across Indian country. So this, again, slide is yours really to form, but those are just some examples of messages that resonated in previous presentations. So I'll move to this next slide, which is reservation economies and self-determination. I could easily spend, as I often do, even 15, 20 minutes on this slide, but I'll just be brief to say again that we do have talking points that support each slide, but it's important for tribal leaders to hear that homeownership, right, is a driver of our local economies, and it has a big role in strengthening tribal governing institutions at every level. And so we've heard from being out in the community, out in Indian country, that those are 2 points that really sit high with tribal leaders, that they're conducive to local economies and they strengthen self-determination. Excuse me. So again, there's talking points with examples. You draw a lot for this slide out of the handbook itself. There's examples throughout the handbook of how home ownership, right, spurs business development and job growth and workforce, excuse me, and also builds, again, those governing institutions and legal infrastructure. But you could start, while they're peppered throughout the handbook, chapter 1, which focuses on the role of tribal leaders, I think is a good place to start. And I think I will just take a few moments to give a couple of examples, but I'm going to take a water break really quickly. It's spring here in Minneapolis, so with that usually comes the change of season common cold. So thanks for bearing with me. But as we think of home ownership and its role in stimulating tribal economies, we often think of that multiplier effect that home ownership has, and that's what this infographic here represents, is that multiplier effect. Because we often know that increased housing, and research shows, often leads to increased business and job growth, really in order to support the amenities needed and wanted in this kind of growing and thriving community. And one thing we often kind of point out in the slide is how homeownership also leverages housing resources. So we talk about the fact that the federal government has a federal trust responsibility, but at the same time, we know that tribal leaders always struggle with having inadequate resources to meet the housing needs in their communities. So providing, again, homeownership for those that can afford it allows tribes to supplement and leverage their Indian Housing Block Grants, NAHASDA, and really use private capital to also drive their development. And one thing I like to share when we think about, right, kind of that building the self-sufficiency and building kind of less dependency on those federal funds is J.C. Crawford, who is a former tribal chairman and a former housing director for the Sisseton Wahpeton in South Dakota. And one thing that he said, an exercise that he did a couple of years ago, or maybe more, was to calculate if Sisseton only relied on federal funds to meet their housing demand, to meet their housing needs, how long that would take. And he said at the rate of federal funds, maybe they were building a handful of houses a year, and that it would take something outrageous, I think it was like over 100 years or so, to meet that demand, just using federal sources. And I thought that was another incredibly empowering message, in the sense that he knew homeownership was a necessary part of housing in his community for that reason, right? He knew that that model doesn't meet the needs of Sisseton. And when we hear about wait lists across the country that are hundreds and sometimes thousands deep, we know that that model doesn't work, at least on its own, almost anywhere. So again, that's, I think, a common story in many communities. And so again, the talking points will have more information, and there will also be a number of them on the role of homeownership, again, in building and strengthening, right, those governing institutions. And as part of that too, not just the institution building, but homeownership, not just on a tribal level, but is also building capacity, excuse me, and self-sufficiency on an individual level, right? Building the financial capability of the individual home buyers, and it's also providing them through their homes, something that they're passing down to the next generation, an asset and inheritance. So there are just so many ways that homeownership really plugs into community well-being, tribal sovereignty, and tribal economies. Excuse me. So this is a slide that is built around data that the CICD obtained from HUD, and it's looking at, again, the number of HUD 184 loans by type of land, excuse me, and it depicts how, by and large, the HUD 184, loan guarantee program is largely operating on fee land, not on trust land. So when the loan program was opened up around 2005 to fee land, you can see that red line, and that it's really taking off. And our data shows that even past 2015, that this trend continues, and that there's less than 10% of lending that's happening on trust land. So this slide is significant because all of the other slides leading up to it are saying there's a demand and there's capacity, and then you have the reality, which is this slide. And part of the explanation can be that it can be difficult sometimes to lend on trust land. And again, we'll have the more meat of those details and talking points for you. But it's also important to underscore that, and one of our housing leaders shared this with us recently, that red line doesn't mean, right, that there's not the demand, not the capacity on trust land. It's like, no, our tribal members that do live on trust land have similar capacity as those that are part of that red line. But again, it's the systems that really need to be streamlined, and tribal leaders do have a role in creating, more legal certainty for transactions like mortgage loans, and more certainty for lenders to come into trust land areas and offer mortgages. So there's most definitely a mortgage market in Indian country on trust land, but it does need and require the support of tribal leaders to make that happen. And tribal leaders can also be probably the most effective in interfacing with some of the federal agencies and talking about the policies and some of the even internal procedures that need to happen to support and streamline this process. So there are other groups that do some of that advocacy, like the National American Indian Housing Council, but tribes themselves have a significant role in this space. So wanted to make that point. As we talk about less than 10% of the lending happening on trust land, we also have data that makes up the scatter plot that you're seeing here of tribes that have significant amounts of lending happening on trust land. And so the x-axis here is showing the total number of HUD loans that a tribe has made, and the y-axis is showing the percentage of those that are done on trust land. So we kind of carved out this area in the top right of the scatter plot, which is ideal, where you have a high volume of HUD 184s, a high volume of mortgages, and then also a high percentage or share of those happening on trust land. And when we dig deeper into those stories, we find that successes for these different nations is really about tribal self-governance and institution building. So one thing I always like to point out with this slide for possible presenters is take a look and really familiarize yourself with some of these different nations. And you might even find that your nation is represented on the scatter plot. And those different tribes often are really good co-presenters. So for example, just last week at a tribal land staff conference, I was able to present with the Lands Department, or the first tribal LTRO, Land Title and Records Office, from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, which is located on Flathead. And you'll see that Flathead is all the way to the right. So they've done, at least at the time of this graph, which was probably also around 2015, over 400 loans, and they had done over half of those on trust land. So he was able to, George Ducharme from their lands department was able to talk about how their tribe compacted those land management functions from the BIA and really transformed their leasing and title process at Flathead. And so in their case, instead of potentially taking years to get the mortgage, necessary mortgage documents to close on the loan, and yes, you heard me correctly, it can take years. I, for example, have a HUD 184 on trust land on the Bois Forte Reservation, where I'm from in northern Minnesota. And because of some of that lengthy processing time through the BIA, it took me almost 2 years to close on my loan. Well, at Flathead, that literally could have taken an hour or two, that part of the process. So it's incredible what tribes are doing to make homeownership happen, even when it can be difficult. So I think these are really the kind of success stories that you'll want to think about as you're preparing to deliver a presentation. See if you can find one of them, or learn a little bit more about those tribes, both in the Tribal Leaders Handbook, because we do have case studies on a number of these nations, and also on our, again, homeownership clearinghouse, which you can find through the CICD website. We have a whole page of case studies across Indian country on really innovative ways that tribes are making homeownership happen. And as a further example, if there's time in your presentation, let's say you have a 90-minute presentation. That's a pretty long presentation. That would afford you the ability to play this video, Sovereign Lending, A Bright Chance for Survival, which is from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And it not only highlights what I was just sharing with you, which is how they compacted those land management functions, but also really what the tribal leadership, what their tribal council has done over a series of decades to really stand up homeownership in a big way. And if you don't have time to play the video, the talking points will provide like a summary of what their nation has done in the areas of like homebuyer education, providing expectations for rental payments that really set the tone and help tribal members build capacity, and kind of behaviors to pay mortgages on time, which are really important, all the way through being a direct lender themselves and establishing Eagle Bank, which is a native-owned bank, to provide, again, loans to their tribal members. So again, great example. If you choose to play the video, that title also serves as a hyperlink, and it'll bring you straight there. Otherwise, you can find the video. It's right on the main page of the homeownership resource clearinghouse on the CICD website. I think I skipped a slide. Let's go back one. This one's important. So this slide really provides an overview of the resources in the Tribal Leaders Handbook on homeownership. And for background, if you didn't know, the CICD partnered with Enterprise Community Partners to create the handbook, which is available also on the CICD website. where you can download the complete version as a PDF, or you can also submit a form and request a hard copy. But in talking about the handbook, this blueprint, as it says, for tribal leaders, lenders, home buyers, and their partners, really came from the concept directly from tribal leaders, directly from tribal housing leaders, to have a resource that includes everything from the history of housing in Indian country, to navigating some of those complex land systems, to preparing families for home ownership, to finding concrete resources, like that second bullet point, like housing needs assessments, and how do we get started so we can first think of what does homeownership look like in our community now, and what does our community, community desire homeownership to look like for our future. And there are also information on how to make homeownership affordable, because we've also heard that that's sometimes a concern for tribal leaders and also housing leaders, is that sometimes it takes additional subsidies to make homeownership happen. And a quick example I'll give is in the case of the Cheyenne River Sioux. Their housing authority actually provided the model homeownership assessment that's used in the appendix of the handbook, and they also have a case study in the handbook, but how they really took that assessment and identified that there was a need to make homeownership more affordable, that while many tribal members perhaps could afford the mortgage payment, not all of them, I guess, could necessarily, or a good number of them couldn't afford the high cost of putting in the infrastructure, like the water and the sewer lines. And I know in the case of my house, I believe that cost alone, just running water and sewer, was something like $10,000. So, and it can be much higher in other communities. So there are resources for how to, again, provide subsidies, kind of put different patchwork financing together to really make homeownership accessible. So again, the handbook is also a guide to new government and private mortgage programs. So it has a lot of new stuff, even if you're habituated with housing. There'll be stuff that you didn't know about before. They'll be listing new types of lenders, like native CDFIs, or community development financial institutions. And there's also kind of newer concepts like green design that are really transforming Indian housing and homeownership. And throughout really the handbook, in each of its chapters, there are case studies and examples of tribes that have done this successfully already. So I'd say when you're presenting, again, there will be talking points for this slide, but really, get familiar with the handbook, take a look at it to identify, what resources and what case studies might most resonate with the audience that you're going to be engaging. And again, there's not just diversity of the types of case studies and the types of things that they're looking at, but there's also geographical diversity for most of Indian country. So there should be hopefully one that resonates and is close to home. So I'm gonna go, to our next slide, which is really just kind of a visual representation that shows that tribal leaders have a special role. So, and they have a different role than practitioners, right? The role that they play is different from housing leaders or CDFIs, and how they facilitate, home ownership. So the practitioners are really charged with, like, you can see me doing this, the metaphorical rolling up your sleeves and implementing and developing the programs and products and resources. And then the tribal leaders are really helping to create the vision, the strategy, and prioritize, again, those governmental functions that make mortgage lending possible. So again, this visual here, is not a complete list of each of their roles in this space, but it does provide a quick comparison. And so the next slide will really expand on the tribal leader's role and really builds again from chapter 1 of the handbook, which is how tribal leaders can support home ownership. And this slide is really the meat of the conversation. So whereas one of the first slides, why home ownership, can really get the audience engaged and involved, this slide is another kind of point in the presentation where I think your audience will become kind of more perky, and they'll want to hear what you have to say, but they're also going to have, at least in our experience, a lot of questions and a lot of examples from their own community. So this is a really great time. So I would say as you're kind of budgeting your time, I would give this part of the conversation at least about, 15 minutes to go over the slide in detail, provide more examples if appropriate, and again, leave space for your audience to really engage and ask you questions. So the talking points are really, again, lifted out of chapter 1 of the handbook, which talks about kind of three different strategies, which are listed here, the top 3 bullet points, which is understanding how homeownership impacts the social and economic health of the community. And so really understanding, again, that picture of homeownership. And what leaders can do is they can encourage and probably work with their housing authorities to develop a survey using that housing needs assessment, and also establish, community meetings to really learn kind of from community members across the spectrum what their needs are, and that can be anywhere from, right, those that are kind of struggling and have maybe more of a need for lower income rentals, all the way up to maybe some of those working professionals that are commuting and have a desire to live home, really shaping, again, future developments and future products that will be offered. So I think that this part of the work in getting started and really putting the assessment together and doing that in a really intentional and good way, and one that's really representative of the community, is important, because that's going to be the backbone for almost everything else you do to support and facilitate homeownership through programs, through relationships, and through financing. The second is prioritizing, again, those governmental functions that provide certainty for lenders, home buyers, and other stakeholders that are involved in this home buying process. And so that certainly includes establishing legal infrastructure and land management systems. So those are 2 very high-level examples, right? Like putting together the tribal mortgage codes or residential leasing codes, and making sure that they're followed up with enforceable remedies. That's very important, because effective tribal codes and also their enforcement in tribal courts help create an environment that encourages investment and lending. So it's good to have reliable recourse, and tribal leadership definitely has a role there. And then certainly getting involved, becoming more fluent in what the default and mortgage process looks like. And parts of the CICD's National Native Homeownership Coalition really look into how tribes can become more proactive in managing default and foreclosure, but also how they can become more proactive in preventing default and foreclosure. So please do connect with the coalition, again, on our website, and there are resources there too for how to kind of mitigate loan defaults. And developing these partnerships with lenders and others, that's really important. So tribal leaders, again, have a big role to play. And in this case, it's really being able to negotiate, right, with state and federal agencies to set up relationships with private lenders and investors, so that they can access some of these kind of governmental and also conventional loan programs. So again, there's a big role for tribal leaders to play. And one thing that we did not originally include in the presentation, but was brought up recently, is tribal leaders, again, have a big role to play in really advocacy around home ownership. So just as, again, I mentioned, there are other national organizations that represent tribally designated housing authorities and tribes around this space. Tribal leaders themselves can become, through the handbook and through other resources, much better versed and really good advocates for the legislative and the policy changes that need to happen to streamline, again, the process and create more opportunities. And one thing to underscore again, and breathing life into the presentation, this slide is one where if you have examples from your own communities or others that you know of, please do share them here and weave those in throughout the presentation. But there's so many best practices. This could almost be at least an hour by itself, this slide. And so, again, this slide, we call it an optional slide because we probably understand that the presenter is giving examples throughout the entire presentation of what his or her leadership has done to really support home ownership. But this slide could maybe serve as like a summary of those best practices and examples. And we'd also say here you'd preferably maybe include a photo or a graphic of at least one of those examples. So this is a good place to do that, but also this slide doesn't have to come here in the sequence, but it just made sense to us when we were kind of putting the narrative and the talking points together. And then we come to one of our last slides, which talks about curriculum and training opportunities that are up and coming later in 2019. So back about a week ago, and for those that are watching this maybe much later, this is in March 2019, the CICD and the Minneapolis Fed hosted a pilot training that was led by Enterprise Community Partners to bring in about, I think it was about 25 or 30 different tribal housing leaders from across Indian country, excuse me, as far as Alaska and Hawaii, to the Penobscot Nation and Maine, and kind of everywhere in between, and to really bring in the voices of practitioners to take a look at the modules that Enterprise and its partners had developed around the handbook to really make it, I guess, I keep talking about breathing life, but breathing life into the handbook, making it applicable and usable. So the curriculum is targeted, for practitioners. So that could be housing. Also see applications where it's useful for realty professionals at tribes and also CDFI folks. But of course, there's useful components here in that curriculum for tribal leadership. So one thing we like to leave with this slide is that tribal leaders themselves can subscribe to the CICD. Whoops, I apologize. Let me move back. I feel like this presentation has a mind of its own today, but I think it's just user error, actually. Okay, so back to this slide. That tribal leaders can subscribe to CICD and the National Native Homeownership Coalition communications. And as you're presenting the slide, it's such a long URL that it's really hard to share. So I always like to just drive people to the CICD website, and they can, should be pretty easy for them to navigate to find where they can subscribe to communications. But if this, excuse me, presentation is being shared like via email or also on our website, I'll just say that this this link here where it says for announcements also serves as a hyperlink to directly provide the subscription form. But it's also good for tribal leaders rather to take this back and encourage their housing directors, those that might be working in financial education, community development, and other departments of the tribe to subscribe, because this is how they're going to be able to stay close to upcoming announcements on that training and on those resources. So they are in development. We had a powerful week last week in learning how that existing curriculum can be fine-tuned. And again, I think the expectation is that it would be available later this year. And often in the slide or in the presentation, this is a good time for you to share any lasting words of encouragement or an emphasis on the importance of homeownership in our communities and the very critical role that tribal leaders play in creating this ecosystem of homeownership opportunities so that communities can really thrive. I apologize. So this is the very last slide. And if people wanted to learn more about the resources available or get in touch with the CICD, they can find us here at cicd@minneapolis.frb.org. This might be a slide if you were to make yourself available for follow-up, especially around best practices from your community. You could also tailor the slide, add your contact information here as well. So I appreciate everyone taking the time, and we hope that this webinar is useful. Excuse me, burping. Webinar is useful. We hope that you're able to kind of see, through this walkthrough, how you might be able to pick up the presentation and use it. And again, both online and to those in our kind of initial cohort group of what we're calling tribal leader ambassadors and community ambassadors, they'll receive another opportunity to give us feedback, to ask questions, and even fine-tune some of the talking points. And then it will be later made available to everyone else online. Because what we want is for anyone to come to our website and to be able to find this video, find the link to the PowerPoint, find the link to the talking points, and really be able to look through the handbook, which is again going to be accessible online, and through our, through our other resources, so that they're really able to carry the message of homeownership far and wide, but also to really carry the resources behind that message far and wide. So one thing that I think we'd always be interested in, both from our kind of initial pilot group or cohort group of ambassadors, is to know if there are any other resources that would support you in delivering these presentations. Excuse me, beyond those that I shared today. And if so, please do reach out to us at cicd@minneapolis.frb.org. And I think what I'd like to leave everyone with is some places where this presentation has already been shared, and then some potential opportunities in the next year and the years following. But I really want to encourage people to reach out to the CICD for ideas on places we haven't thought of, because we know we're not covering all of Indian country. So without kind of further ado, in the last 6 months or so, the latter part of 2018, in the early part of 2019, we have been a number of different places. Beginning in October, we actually, through our partners, were at the Opportunity Finance Network conference on the Native Gathering Day, which is hosted by First Nations Awista, and that's a largely Native CDFI audience, and they were talking really about the potential for Native CDFIs to be more involved in supporting homeownership through, home buyer readiness programs, and also through direct lending. So that was an incredible day in Chicago. Also that same month, we, like as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, we're at the National Congress of American Indians annual convention. And again, they really stood up and supported homeownership and made it prominent as part of their theme that year. And we had a number of breakout sessions, and one of them was focused on this presentation, and the other kind of birthed the idea for this webinar. So this is great. And then a couple months later, we were at the National American Indian Housing Council's Legal Symposium in December, and our National Native Homeownership Coalition had a number of tracks. So it included this session, but also many others as well. We've taken this, show on the road, so to speak, several times this past month in March at USET. So the United Southern and Eastern Tribes held their kind of Impact and Unity Days in DC, and our CICD director, Patrice Kunich, was there with the Four Directions, Native CDFI, and some of their tribal leaders to talk about this message. And then again, just this past month, we shared this message at the National Tribal Land Staff Conference, so with land staff and realty professionals, and really underscoring what an important role they play in homeownership. So sometimes I think they often feel siloed, but really the work that they do is some of the foundations of the lending process. And we also did another webinar with the Seminole Nation's Native Learning Center. So if you're interested, that version exists on the Native Learning Center website, and it was delivered on March 7th if you're looking, because they have many presentations. And so then in the upcoming year, as we were trying to identify other opportunities for where this message can be shared, we noted a few, and some of them have already happened, and they might be opportunities then for 2020, but we talked about the Northwest Indian Housing Association. They have an annual conference. The Southern Plains Indian Housing Association, they also have an annual conference. Both of those are usually in January. The Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, always NAIHC, so we do have planned sessions this year as well, upcoming in May, and I think they'll be in Denver this year. And we also have kind of marked on our calendars possible sessions in June and October with NCAI. Again, they are kind of partnering with the CICD to put together videos and webinars that take it even a step further than what we're talking about here today, and they get really into kind of the modules and the details specifically for tribal leaders. And then in the fall, we are told that there are opportunities like the Southwest Tribal Housing Alliance, the AFN, Alaska Federation of Natives annual meeting, of course USET again, but we know that there's other regional opportunities, like with other regional Indian housing authorities. I missed one, by the way. We were at Unahad in August of 2018, but other opportunities like that. Also, those that might exist with regional tribal chairman associations, and probably so many others that we just don't have plotted on our handbook outreach calendar. So please share those with us, and let us know where you might be interested in carrying this message, because we'll also make sure that we amplify that. So as we work with NCEI, but also just here at the center and through our coalition, we really do like to lift up the great work of our partners, the great work of our future ambassadors. So please share back those stories with us via email. If you take pictures when you're presenting or have someone else do so, that's even better. So again, I'm excited about the opportunity here, and the CAICD just wants to thank you for your time, for your future feedback, and for serving, right, as tribal and community ambassadors for homeownership, both in your own communities, but also on regional and national levels. And in this next year, again, we'll be partnering to deliver messages and webinars. And we just want to make sure that we're, again, cross-promoting everyone's contribution. So while a lot of this is still under development, it's coming soon, just like that curriculum. And we know that this work takes many hands, and we know that your participation, as well as everyone else who is viewing this even years from now, are really important, and they're going to have great impacts and success on all of these efforts. So again, thank you for joining me. Thank you for your interest, and please also thank you for your feedback and your engagement. So I think with that, I will say Giga Wabaman. We will see you all later out and about in Indian country at housing conferences, at tribal leadership conferences, and just looking forward to all of our cross partnerships. Thank you.